Just going to do a quick video here that shows my proposed On3 layout. A few weeks ago I uploaded one, and after I uploaded it I decided to make a few changes to the plan, and which changed the model, so I recreated the model. This model here is designed in CAD and 3D, and then the benchwork is 3D printed on a EPAX printer. And then I just took some cardboard and I printed out the track plan, glued it to the cardboard, cut out the cardboard, and then glued it onto the 3D printed benchwork, set the elevations to scale. So all the track elevations are to scale. The scale of this model is 1/24th scale. And one thing to keep in mind here is that the base here is not the floor. This would represent 44 inches off the floor. I didn't want to go through and make legs and everything on this plan, because the goal wasn't to show how the layout was built, but the goal was to test the scenery contours to make sure that the distances back here between the lower track and the upper track, that it wasn't going to make any impossible scenery slopes. And so that was really the purpose. So I glued the lower level right down to the foam core here, and then the distance between levels here is actually to scale. It's really hard to get a representation of how tall this is, but here where my finger is pointing, this is actually 52 inches from the floor. So the bottom of this level, the upper level here, is 70 inches. It hits me right about in the forehead. So when I would be standing next to this layout, I wouldn't really see this upper level here. This would be above my head. This is 8 feet 2 inches off the floor here. The top of this level. This plan is a mushroom plan, meaning that when you're in this area here, you only see the lower level here and the lower level here, and the upper level you see is just the back of the backdrop. As you're inside the mushroom, you only see the upper deck, and the lower deck, the back of it is what's actually supporting the front of the upper deck. Now I've left an overhang here of 6 inches so that you have toe space. There'll be a raised platform inside of all the mushroom spaces, which would be here, here, and here. And the backdrop for the lower level is not all the way to the face. The upper level is about 6 inches over the bottom level, so that your toes would go underneath there and you don't kick the lower level with your feet when you're standing inside the mushroom. As we walk into the room here, this represents, there would be a door right here. This was just a wall to kind of signify the end of the room, but there'd be a door, and we'd walk into the room here. This door opens outward into the room. And as we come around the corner here, there's a closet door. This door opens out this way, and this goes underneath a set of stairs, and it's used for storage for the house. There'll be a drop gate here, which is the extension for the switchback track, and then you can walk through a door which would be right on this wall, and this would go to the workshop. And also the utility, the furnace is actually back over here. Now there's another wall in the next room right about here, and the furnace is sitting right here. Right where this backdrop ends, there's actually a concrete wall that comes out here, so this track that goes through the wall here will be on a shelf in here for staging. But let's start the tour on the lower level, and then we'll work our way up to what you're seeing here, which is the upper level. So I'm going to take apart this model here. This piece comes out, and then this piece comes out. And so what you're seeing here is the lower level. This is seen from when you first walk through the room. Now this layout is patterned after the Mans Creek narrow gauge railroad, which ran from Sewell, West Virginia up to Clifftop, West Virginia, and at one time had a branch to a town called Landisburg. Clifftop was where the coal operations were really centered around. There were several mines up around the Clifftop area. They would haul coal down to the Chesapeake in Ohio, and they would either have it converted to coke coal or coke and sent in hoppers, or they would have it sized into 4 different sizes and shipped out in standard gauge cars. They also had a small interchange yard down here, and what would happen would be they would load cut lumber from the narrow gauge cars into the standard gauge cars, or they would transfer some stuff uh, from the standard gauge into maybe freight cars or whatever to be brought up somewhere on the narrow gauge. I don't know really how frequently they interchange there, um, but of course, in a model railroad, I'll probably end up having more activity there than what the prototype really did, just so there's more operations. The Chesapeake, Ohio really had multiple tracks down here, but this is only 2 feet wide down here, so I only representing the Chesapeake and Ohio going through the scene as a single track, mostly just to give the presence of the standard gauge. Whenever modeling narrow gauge, it's kind of nice to have at least some standard gauge track on the layout to give a size perspective. What I've added here is a few this car here and this flat car loaded lumber and this box. These are box cars here. They're 2-scale standard gauge O scale cars, and the cars on the track, front track here, those are narrow gauge cars. I've got a couple flat cars and box cars and some flat cars with lumber that's being transferred onto the standard gauge cars. The tracks all in this area here will all be dual gauge, and they will and then this will be probably dual gauge for a little bit here in case I need to come out here and maybe back something up into there. This would be the Chesapeake, Ohio station at Sewell, and then I'm going to have some Mans Creek structures here, like a freight depot and different things they had down there. This represents a piece of Old State Road, I believe it was called, and it also crossed. It would come off the layout here and it crossed over here. I'm going to have to modify the scenery right here to get that to cut across there. It was kind of an afterthought that I would model the crossing there. I'm also considering pulling this track a little closer to the backdrop, and then so I have a little more room for some structures there to help hide this kind of strange way how the Chesapeake, Ohio will end up running into the backdrop. This is a taller home here. It's kind of a 2-level home, so when you're down there, it'll kind of block the view of that track coming there or going off the layout. Here we can see a small little 2-scale. This is a 124 scale model of a 148 scale Shay, and these are the hopper cars, just to give an example of how big a train is in this scene here. Kind of see again down here at the interchange. Old State Road would have ran here and then kind of crossed up this way and run along here and kept going up the mountain. So it just added some dwellings on this side. They had houses on both sides of the tracks in here and kind of up the mountain, which we're basically standing on the mountain looking down towards the New River Gorge, which would be here. This is a scale model of the Coke Railroad and Coke Yard office that I built. I've currently built this model here. If you go to Railroad Line Forums, go to the narrow gauge, logging, mining, and narrow gauge section of that forum, and look up Slater Creek Railway. You can actually find at the end, mixed in with that post on building this layout, you can see my progress on building that actual structure. Also here, this is the stone engine house that Mans Creek had. Also my post, you can see how I built that structure as well. From this point down to this backdrop, this already exists and is built and functioning. This came out of a previous layout that I had. When I moved to this house that this layout is being built at, this was the only section of the layout I saved, other than a little piece that I saved up here, because this is a greatly expanded model of that layout. That layout occupied 190 square feet room. This layout is about 400 square feet. What you're seeing here is you're seeing the 2 dump trestles that the Mans Creek had. Being that this is O scale, I didn't have the room to put it in the exact order. The prototype would have had a switch coming off of here and more of a runaround that cut through here, and this structure would have been sitting in there, but on my previous layout I didn't have the room. This went into a backdrop right here, and And so I kind of severely compressed this structure, but modeled this one as to scale as possible. On the prototype, there would have been a chute going way down a hill here to a tipple, and then the C&O would have been down here, and then the new river would have been over here, but this scene's only 2 feet deep, so I chose to model it again here as if the operator was on the mountain looking down towards the new river. The backdrop here has an image on it from trackside sceneries. It has a piece of the river in there and trees on there, and we'll get to that when I actually install this on the layout. I had that all on the previous layout, but because the image was glued to the backdrop and the backdrop was attached to the wall, when that layout came down, that image got destroyed. So I'll have to get another one exactly like it. In here, as the train leaves the dump trestle here, this whole time we're going up grade, so we're down by the new river. This grade would have been longer and steeper on the prototype, but I didn't have the room. So this track, this C&O would have been a lot farther down, a lot lower elevation than this track here. But we're climbing up, we're going around here, and I'm gonna have to make a hole in the backdrop to disguise here. And as we cut across, there'll be a lift bridge right in this section here to span this opening. And then we're going to come into a more or less fictional scene here, and I'll explain the purpose of this scene later. This isn't something I want to do. The Mans Creek never had any tunnels, but unfortunately sometimes in the model railroad world we have to do some things to help the model, the layout work out that the prototypes don't have to deal with. The elevation here is about 52 inches, but at the minute we leave this tunnel on the other side, we start climbing up, and we get all the way up till we reach an elevation at the switchback here of 62 inches. So we've climbed 10 inches from here to here. This is probably one of the more difficult areas to handle with a double level layout, because the distance from the bottom of this, actually I'm sorry, I see this is 61 inches, but from the bottom of this level, or the bottom of this track here to the next level above, is half the distance between the upper and lower deck as it is here. So this is the tightest squeeze here. Down here I have almost 18 inches of deck separation. Here I have raised this up 2 inches, so I'm getting about 13 inches of deck separation, more or less right here. The reason why is because I'll explain why this isn't half of this, but we'll get to that in a minute here. So as the train is coming up, as the train leaves Sewell area, we're pushing the cars up here, and we come into the switchback. In order to get the grade I needed here to get to the mushroom, I had to put the turnout for the switchback here, which required an extension of a drop-down gate. You know, during normal operations this will be up, but working on the layout I'll have that down. Right above the switchback, the Mans Creek had a runaround. And the purpose of that was so that as a trains going uphill here would have been backed up here, and the engine would have been on this end, and then they would have traveled up to cliff top engine first. But loaded trains coming down, because they were using Lincoln pin couplers, came down locomotive first. Then they ran around the train here, and they backed into the switchback here and went down this grade locomotive first as well. So the purpose, so having this runaround here was really important. The runaround is on a very slight grade. The difference is 1 inch overall from here, so it's 61 here and 62 here. That's enough. That grade is low enough that the cars that are in here don't roll out of here, but it's enough that it gives me 1 more inch to help reduce the grade from here to the upper deck. As we leave this point, we come into the only single level part of the layout, and this is a 5% grade from when we start to leave this turnout here until we reach up here on the upper level as it gets to come above this area here. The reason for this fictitious scene here is that the vertical distance between this track and this track is so great, yet the horizontal distance to be able to make this curve to come around the wall, there wasn't enough horizontal distance to be able to make the scenery work out. So rather than having a very unusual looking cliff that came out at an angle, I extended the upper deck over here, and this tunnel helps hide a support to stabilize that upper deck that'll be sitting right in this space here. And so the train will travel onto actually a second deck over the top of this deck. The biggest change I made from this layout to the one I posted a few weeks ago is I didn't like how close this track here was to this track here. I wanted to add some more space here to help improve the slope of the scenery in this area. So I pulled this lower track 4 inches this way, and it made a lot of the scenery here more realistic. Even though it's not exactly realistic that the tracks are stacked in the same scene, it at least makes the scenery more believable looking. There is 2 trestles on the Mans Creek that are just like this, that come in front of a solid rock wall. And so I'm going to model one of those here. This will actually be what they called the dry wall trestle. The other one was called a wet wall trestle because it had water coming down behind this space here and out the bottom. But I didn't want to have another stream come through here, so I'm going to just call this dry wall trestle. And then this is a semi-fictional structure here. The Mans Creek did have a high trestle spanning Glade Creek, but I'm just moving that down here because I wanted to have a stream that came through this scene and exited out here. And so this is a semi-fictional trestle here. So that as the train is leaving this lower level here, or leaving the single level here, the distance from here down to here is actually 70 inches. So an operator standing in this area here will be more or less looking up at their train here. My intent is to have the backdrop actually curve up onto the ceiling here so that the sky will continue onto the room ceiling, and then I'll have a panel in the ceiling hang down a couple inches to have lighting all in this area aiming out into this scene here. So as we now leave the lower level to the upper level, real quick before we leave this scene here, this pink represents a concrete block wall. This particular house is built with a 6-foot high cinder block wall here, and then from here on up is regular wood framing. On the outside of the house, the land slopes down from just below this 6-foot concrete wall down to grade down here. I did have to carve away the foam here a little bit, and I did have to cut away a little bit of this wall here because I glued the upper level to some cardstock to help it be stronger, because the resin castings are a little bit fragile. See, it's got a unrealistic thickness to it. Also, when the scenery dried, it pulled this out. This would normally be tight here, and this wouldn't be this angle here. But for our purpose, it works fine. So when the upper level comes on here, you're probably wondering, well, what about this scene here? The bottom of this bridge that crossed there is 75 inches from here to the floor. So I'm 72 inches high, so I've got a 3-inch clearance as I walk underneath here. Now anybody who's taller than that, this would be a knot under here, and I'll have to probably put a little foam paddle on there, but I'm sort of building the layout for myself, and most operators I know actually aren't much taller than 6 feet, so the people I have come over probably will not ever have a problem with this. It's only guests that I have come over, I have to warn them that they'll have to nod underneath this. So as trains come up, they now transfer to the upper level here, and there's a little bit of a scene here where the train kind of comes between a little valley here. Even though there'd probably be a stream here, I couldn't realistically make the scenery work out. So this is another kind of semi-fictional area here. As the train starts to make its move around this corner here, the operator will have to come back underneath here, and this gate will only be down when trains are traveling through here. Otherwise, its normal position will be up. So the operator will walk under here and go up 2 steps to a 20-inch high raised platform. That'll put this deck in this particular spot. It's kind of high. It's about 60 inches high for a moment here, as we have to be high enough to cross over this area that has to be walked under, and this area here, which we'll get to in a minute. So there really isn't much to do here. There's just a junction of two branches here. So I don't really, and it's very narrow, so I don't mind that's really high here. It's about chin level right here. The operator will then come in here and then at this point decide if they're going to back down this branch to operate, if they're going to take the branch to the left and go to Landisburg, or if they're going to take the branch to the right and go to Clifftop. If a train is going to Landisburg, which would be the track back here, the operator then would go back down 2 more steps. The bottom of this is also 75 inches, and they'll be able to walk underneath here and come into this other space that's created by the mushroom, which is in here. The reason why I wanted to walk down here is because in this room there's a circuit panel in here for the house, and code requires a 3-foot square area here for anyone to get into to access that breaker box. So I've actually created this space in here. You know, it'll be kind of strange if an electrician has to come in, they'll walk in here and I'll have to tell them to go up this hallway, down these stairs, duck under that, but they'll be in this space right here that is accessible. So if we add the mushroom plan in here, I'll try to do this with one hand. So what you can see now here is that there is a space. So as the operator, get this little square here, as the operator comes up into here, they're standing on a platform here, they can access all the switches here. They'll walk down, there's enough space here that they'll be level ground. They'll walk under here, come out on this side of the layout here, walk up 2 steps so they're back on a platform again, and their train will come out into this town here that I'm temporarily just saying it's kind of a similar town to what would be Landisburg on the Mans Creek. Now I have a couple, this would be a truck loading dock here or a small mine, and then this is a larger mine. The Mans Creek had a lot of mines all scattered through the area, but of course because this is a layout in a room, I have to compress many of these scenes together to form one scene that that's kind of reflecting what they could do. There was a company store that they had in Landisburg. Although it was more along, it probably would have been better to put it over here, but there's just not enough room in the backdrop here. This area in here is quite large. The space between here and the wall is 2 feet, but it opens up to a 4-foot operating area right in here. Sorry about my finger there. The only thing I modeled of the sawmill at Landisburg was the drying yard here, because that's probably where a good majority of the switching that I wanted to replicate was at. There'd be empty flat cars coming in and loaded flat cars going out, and there's a bunch of different tracks. These tracks will actually extend through into the wall cavity in here to allow about 2 more cars kind of hidden in here. So for example, this track may actually be able to hold 5 cars. This track 4 cars, this track 3 cars. But there'll be a lot of switching of pulling out loaded cars, and they'll set them out over here, and then they'll take the empties and bring them back here. There is an engine house. I can put some logging type engines in here. There's a simulated through track through the yard. This would continue on to go on to the end where maybe the woods trains would be. I am going to use this as a visible staging track, so I will have an empty logging train sitting here at the beginning of this session. That train will be the first train out. It will travel down this line, through this backdrop, through this junction, straight through here, into this scene, and through the wall into a staging track located in the next room. That will help clear out this town for the first train to arrive in that is actually going to be switching here. This will be these trains here, as you can see, this small shay and a couple of hoppers will work the mines, and they'll also pick up loaded lumber cars. Now I know that the actual operations were that lumber trains would travel from here down to Sewell on their own, but the way I'm going to operate it is that these trains here will pick up loaded lumber cars along with their coal trains and take them out. they'll also spot empty cars on this track for the yard engine here to spot on these sidings. The reason why I'm going to operate that way is because all the larger shays and coal hoppers for the Mans Creek I have will only operate on 30-inch minimum radius curves and number 5 turnouts. In order to get this all to fit in here, this is a 26-inch radius and these are number 4 turnouts, and so I'll have a yard engine here that'll be smaller and it can handle the turnouts in here, and they'll just come out and use this track along the company store as their where they'll get their loads and or get their empties and place loads. There's a runaround here, so a crew that works here can just head back and forth as much as they need to between here and Sewell. So let's go back to this junction here. If we take the track on the right, we can come through the backdrop. We'll come out into this area. This is more or less a fictional mine, but it's again, the Mans Creek had many mines, and I'm just going to move one to this spot here to kind of use this area I had. They didn't have, I don't know if they had any bridges like this, but this will help hide the train coming through the backdrop, so I don't need another tunnel. Got some foam in there right now at the moment. They'll come along this kind of mountainous area here. They're going to cross one of the little streams, many streams they cross there at the cliff or at the cliff top location, and then they're going to come along and encounter the truck strip coal loading tipple where trucks were used to trucks would back in here, dump into this giant hopper, and they would be discharged loading 3 cars at a time. This structure is to scale. It's not compressed, however it is flipped. It would have been on this side of the track, but what I did was I flipped it and turned it around. The turnout should come this direction, but if I made the turnout come this direction and flipped it, it would have been a mirrored structure, and I didn't want to mirror any structures. I want to make them actually like they are, so if they've changed the size of the tracks, I have to turn them around. As we come into the car shops area, this is the Mans Creek car shop. It is also to scale. It's not compressed. And I have put a runaround here. The real Mans Creek did not have a runaround, but for operating purposes on a model it works better. There would have also been a turnout that went this way up to the company store, but obviously I don't have room because it runs into the backdrop. So I ended up putting the turnout here, which runs into the back basement of the company store. This structure is also to scale. So it is a very large structure. It's 4 stories tall. This would be the front. Unfortunately, the front faces the backdrop, but you will be able to kind of get a little bit of a view of the front by standing here and looking down this way. I figured it was more important to focus on the operating side of the structure rather than visual side of it. Many of the decisions I made in this layout were for better operations versus better scenic. While trying to keep the scenery in mind, I still wanted it to operate very well. You can see here we have a train sitting in here that would be ready to work the strip coal loading tipple here. There would be places to put cars, set out cars that need mechanical work done. There'll be the occasional car to the company store. This runaround is long enough for a locomotive and a couple cars, but most of the switching is just working this tipple from this spot on, and the only thing that this runaround is really for is to get the locomotive and a caboose ends swapped here. So if we come back over to this junction here, and we were to take this track here, we'd come through the backdrop here. Now this area is another area that has a raised platform, and it is accessed from steps up in this area here. This would be more like the Mans Creek mine number 7. It was a rather large mine. There's not very many pictures of it. Matter of fact, only one that I know of that shows it from this side here. And all we know is that it did look somewhat like this, and it did have this coal storage silo here where they could load coal cars from, where they could load them directly from the tipple. I did put just a couple random structures around here just to kind of break up the scene and not have it be so many O-scale trees I have to make. The This part of the layout is relatively high as well. This is probably about neck level here, but there's really only one turnout. All the tracks are close to the edge. And to help keep the front edge even lower yet, there'll be a small stream running along the edge, which will keep all this scenery tapering down and giving it the effect that it's a lot lower than it really is. And this is just the same track. This is that branch that will go through to hidden staging. Some of the goals I have here is a possible curtain across here to help isolate this scene, so when operators are in here, they can't see an operator in here, which will help also make this junction scene feel like it's more isolated. This area here is also going to feel isolated because it's its own scene as well as this scene. One of the things I really wanted to enforce was the feeling of being isolated in the mountains of West Virginia, and I wanted no scenes stacked with multiple operators, so everybody will be in their own spaces. There will be this is probably the only scene in the layout where there's scenes adjacent from each other here, where could be a possible operator here and here. Otherwise, from wherever you are in the layout room, the only scene that you're focused on is the scene that's in front of you, and no other ones are visible, keeping the sounds and the clutter of multiple trains and multiple operators to an absolute minimum. Thanks. Again, if you want to follow along on this in the design process, you can go find my Railroad Line forum post. Look for Slater Creek Railway. That was the name that I originally posted under. Still debating whether it's going to be called that or if I'm just going to call it Mans Creek. Thanks for watching.